The night was buzzing with anticipation as millions of Americans tuned in to The Nation Speaks, a primetime political talk show known for its heated debates. Hosted by the sharp-tongued, left-leaning commentator Ethan Calloway, the show had built its reputation by grilling conservative figures on live television. Tonight's episode, however, was unlike any other, because it featured none other than the sitting Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance. As the intro music faded and the camera zoomed in on the show's polished set, Ethan adjusted his tie, a smirk playing on his lips. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have the honor of welcoming Vice President J.D. Vance, he said, his voice dripping with barely concealed sarcasm. Mr. Vance, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule of, well, whatever it is that you do. J.D. Vance, dressed in a crisp navy suit, leaned back in his chair and let out a small chuckle. Glad to be here, Ethan. You know, when I got the invitation, I almost thought it was a prank. But hey, I figured I'd stop by and check on how America's favorite liberal echo chamber is doing. The studio audience gasped, and Calloway's smirk faltered for just a moment before he quickly regained his composure. He wasn't going to let Vance get the upper hand, at least that's what he thought. Right? Calloway continued, flipping through his notes. Let's start with the basics. The administration you're part of has been pushing policies that many experts say are, frankly, outdated and harmful. Take, for example, your stance on immigration. You oppose open borders, but studies show that diversity strengthens the economy. So why are you so adamant about keeping immigrants out? J.D. Vance cracked his knuckles, leaning forward with a grin. Oh, Ethan, this is going to be fun. He adjusted his microphone, ready to deliver a response that no one, not Calloway, not the audience, not even America, was prepared for. The moment J.D. Vance leaned forward, a shift in the atmosphere was palpable. Even those watching from home could sense that something electrifying was about to happen. All right, Ethan, Vance said, clasping his hands together. Let's break this down like adults, shall we? First, you mentioned that diversity strengthens the economy. Great talking point. I've heard it 100 times. But let me ask you something. If diversity alone made countries rich, why isn't Venezuela leading the world in GDP? Calloway blinked. Well, that's... No, let me finish, Vance interrupted, holding up a finger. The truth is, strong economies aren't built on diversity quotas. They're built on law and order, a fair legal system, and protecting jobs for hardworking Americans. You talk about immigration like it's just a buffet where people can walk in and take whatever they want. But I'm here to tell you, Ethan, America isn't a self-service restaurant. The audience erupted in laughter, some clapping, others gasping. Calloway gritted his teeth and forced a chuckle. Well, that's a cute analogy, Mr. Vice President, but let's stick to the facts. Studies show that immigrants contribute billions to the economy. Legal immigrants, Ethan. Vance shot back, pointing a finger. Legal immigrants play by the rules and I support them. My own grandparents were immigrants. But when you let millions flood in without vetting, without skills, without even a plan, you don't strengthen the economy, you create chaos. You overload hospitals, stretch welfare programs thin, and drive wages down for the working class. You know who suffers the most? Poor Americans, black, white, Hispanic. Everyone who's trying to make an honest living. Calloway shifted in his seat. He had faced tough debaters before, but Vance wasn't just spewing talking points. He was dismantling the liberal playbook live on air. Okay, Calloway said, quickly scanning his notes. Let's move on. Your administration has also been criticized for what many call anti-science policies, especially regarding climate change. The world is burning, Mr. Vice President. Yet, your party continues to prioritize fossil fuels over green energy. Why are you ignoring the science? J.D. Vance burst out laughing. Not a nervous laugh, not a dismissive chuckle. An actual hearty laugh. Ethan, buddy, do you drive a car? Calloway hesitated. Of course I do. And what does it run on? Calloway's face turned red. Go ahead, Vance said, smirking. Say it. Gasoline, Calloway muttered. Gasoline, Vance repeated, throwing his hands up. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Ethan Calloway, warrior of the climate movement, whose entire career is powered by the same fossil fuels he wants to ban. The crowd erupted again, with laughter rippling across the studio. Even Calloway's co-hosts, usually aligned with his viewpoints, were stifling smiles. Ethan tried to recover. That's a ridiculous argument. We have to start somewhere. The transition to green energy is the future, and it's being pushed by billionaires who fly private jets to climate summits while telling you to ride a bicycle. Vance shot back. You want to force a transition before the technology is ready. That's not science, that's politics disguised as science. Americans want affordable energy. They want jobs. They don't want to be lectured by people who don't even follow their own rules. The audience roared with applause. Calloway took a sip of water, visibly rattled. This wasn't going the way he had planned. And J.D. Vance? He was just getting warmed up. Calloway exhaled sharply, his composure visibly shaken. He was known for dismantling conservative guests with ease, but J.D. Vance wasn't just holding his ground. He was turning the interview into a masterclass on political combat. Desperate to regain control, Calloway straightened his tie and pressed forward. All right, let's talk about democracy. Many Americans believe your party's stance on election security is just a veiled attempt at voter suppression. Your administration has supported voter ID laws, limits on mail-in ballots. Why make it harder for people to vote? Vance smirked, as if he had been waiting for this moment. Ethan, you ever been to a bar? Calloway blinked. Excuse me? A bar? Vance repeated. Where people drink. You ever been to one? Well, sure, And what do you need to get a drink there? Vance interrupted. Calloway frowned. A valid ID, obviously. Ah. Vance nodded theatrically. So, let me get this straight. You need an ID to buy alcohol, to drive a car, to board a plane, to apply for welfare, to buy certain cold medicines, but suddenly, asking for an ID to vote is voter suppression? Do you hear how ridiculous that sounds? The crowd erupted in applause once again. Calloway opened his mouth but hesitated. He knew whatever he said would likely play into Vance's hands. Vance wasn't done. You guys on the left love screaming democracy is at risk. But let me ask you something. What's more dangerous? Making sure every voter is who they say they are, or allowing thousands of ballots to be mailed in with no verification? Do you lock your door at night, Ethan? Calloway rolled his eyes. Of course I do. Why? Calloway sighed. Because I don't want strangers walking in. Exactly, Vance said, snapping his fingers. But you want to run a country where anyone can waltz in, vote, and disappear without a trace? I hate to break it to you, but that's not democracy. That's a free-for-all. The audience was eating it up. Even some liberal-leaning viewers at home were nodding in reluctant agreement. Calloway's frustration was starting to boil over. He glanced at his producers off-camera, but they gave him nothing. This was live TV and J.D. Vance was running the show now. All right, Calloway said, clearly irritated. Let's pivot to another issue. You've been accused of supporting culture war policies that many see as divisive. You oppose things like gender-affirming care for minors, certain school curriculums that promote so-called woke ideologies. Why can't conservatives just let people live their lives? Vance leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. Ethan, let's get one thing straight. I don't care how adults choose to live their lives. But when it comes to kids, that's a different story. He turned to the camera, addressing the millions watching. Listen, America, if you're under 18, you can't vote, you can't get a tattoo without parental consent, and in some states, you can't even buy a lottery ticket. But somehow, you think a 13-year-old should be able to make life-altering medical decisions that they might regret later? That's not letting people live their lives. That's insanity. The audience burst into applause once again, while Calloway was left fumbling for a response. And schools. Vance continued. Parents have every right to know what their kids are being taught. If a school is more focused on teaching kids about activism than math, that's a problem. If a school hides things from parents, that's a problem. We're not fighting a culture war. We're standing up for common sense. And if that offends you, Then maybe it's time you reconsidered who's actually being divisive. Calloway sat in silence for a moment, then forced a grin. Well, Mr. Vice President, I have to say, this has been quite the conversation. Vance grinned back. Oh, I'm just getting started. Ethan Calloway was running out of ammunition. Every time he thought he had J.D. Vance cornered, the Vice President effortlessly flipped the argument, leaving the liberal host scrambling for a response. The audience could feel it. The viewers at home could sense it. And Calloway himself? He knew it too, but he wasn't ready to surrender just yet. All right, Mr. Vice President, Calloway said, forcing a polite smile. Let's take a broader look at your party's vision. The administration you're part of talks a big game about saving America. But let's be real, your policies appeal mostly to the conservative base. How do you expect to unite the country when you're so busy dividing it? Vance let out a slow chuckle, shaking his head. Ethan, let me tell you something. America isn't divided because of conservative policies. America is divided because people like you have spent years telling half the country that they're the enemy. Calloway frowned. Excuse me? Oh, don't play dumb, Vance said, waving a hand dismissively. You and your media buddies have spent years calling millions of hardworking Americans racists, bigots, threats to democracy, just because they dare to have a different opinion. You mock them. You ridicule their faith. You insult their values. And then you have the audacity to turn around and ask, why is America so divided? The audience fell silent. Calloway opened his mouth but stopped himself. Vance wasn't done. You want to talk about unity? Fine, let's talk about it. You think America is more divided now than it was, say, 20 years ago? Calloway hesitated. Well, I suppose. Of course it is, Vance said. And you know why? Because the people in charge, the media, the elites, the bureaucrats, they don't actually want unity. They thrive on division. They love when Americans are fighting over race, gender, or some new made-up crisis. Because if we're too busy fighting each other, we don't pay attention to what they're doing. Calloway's face was unreadable. Vance turned to the audience, his voice calm but firm. America isn't divided because of regular folks. It's divided because the people in power make a fortune off keeping it that way. And I'm here to tell you, it's time to stop falling for it. The room was dead silent for a beat, and then applause. Deafening, thunderous applause. Even Calloway looked stunned. He glanced at his producers, who were frantically signaling that they were out of time. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple before turning back to the camera. Well, that's all we have for tonight, he said, his voice a little softer than before. Vice President J.D. Vance, thanks for joining us. Vance smiled. My pleasure, Ethan. Let's do this again sometime. The credits rolled. The cameras cut. And across America, millions of viewers sat in stunned silence, because they had just witnessed something they never expected. A conservative walked into a liberal's house. And he won. The moment the broadcast ended, social media exploded. Within minutes, hashtags like hashtag Vance destroys Calloway, hashtag speechless America, and hashtag liberal meltdown were trending across Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. Clips of J.D. Vance's takedowns flooded the internet, racking up millions of views in mere hours. Conservative commentators hailed it as a legendary moment. Today we witnessed a masterclass in debating. One viral post read, J.D. Vance walked into enemy territory, dismantled every talking point, and left without breaking a sweat. Fox News hosts were giddy with excitement, replaying the best moments on a loop. This wasn't just a debate, one commentator declared. This was a complete intellectual beatdown. But on the liberal side, panic. Ethan Calloway's fanbase was in shambles. His supporters flooded social media with excuses. Vance was just using rhetorical tricks. But even they couldn't deny that their guy had been outmatched. Left-wing media outlets scrambled to spin the event. J.D. Vance's misleading talking points read one headline. Vice President uses cheap populist rhetoric to win over low-information voters, claimed another. But the damage was done. The biggest sign of Vance's victory? Memes. Within hours, meme makers had a field day. A Titanic-style gif showing Calloway's confidence sinking as Vance delivered his punchlines. A photoshopped picture of Calloway holding a tiny white flag with the caption, "I surrender. The best of all?" A Mortal Kombat edit with Vance wins. Fatality. Flashing across the screen. Even Calloway himself, now the internet's favorite punching bag, was forced to acknowledge the disaster. On his next show, he sighed, shaking his head. Well, that didn't go as planned. Meanwhile, the White House was loving it. J.D. Vance, now the unofficial conservative hero of the internet, responded in his signature style. "Well, folks," he tweeted, "I went on The Nation Speaks expecting a debate. Instead, I got a free comedy special. Thanks for watching." The tweet amassed over 10 million likes. One thing was clear, America had just witnessed a turning point. This wasn't just another political debate. It was a cultural moment, a sign that the old media tricks weren't working anymore, that conservatives didn't have to play defense, that someone like J.D. Vance could walk into the lion's den and leave the king. As the dust settled, one question remained. Who would dare invite J.D. Vance on live TV again?